Okay, welcome everybody. I am really excited to talk about Hanukkah today. Today is actually the sixth day of Hanukkah this year. Um, and so, we're nearing the end of Hanukkah, but it's still a great time to learn about it. So I want to start with the shirt that I'm wearing, which the bottom is actually the most important part. So I'm going to stand up for a minute, which is how do we spell Hanukkah? So this is, the age-old question in the United States. How do we spell it? Is it an H? Is it a CH? Is it two N's? Is it two K's? How do we spell Hanukkah? And of course, like many good Jewish answers, the answer is they're all right, because really they're all just transliterations of the Hebrew, which is where I wanted to start. So the Hebrew way of spelling Hanukkah looks like this. Um, and the word Hanukkah itself means dedication, or in this case, we're talking about the rededication of the temple. So the dedication is what this day, at least what it's called. And so when we're spelling it in all these other ways, it's really just our transliteration. It's kind of that sound of the word Hanukkah putting into English letters. So any way you want to spell Hanukkah in English is totally fine. So what I want to talk about today is, where does the holiday of Hanukkah come from? And how has it changed over time? And what are some of the different themes? And what exactly are we celebrating when we celebrate Hanukkah? Because, of course, for many people, it's latkes and dreidels and funny hats and clothes and all of that. But Hanukkah is a really, really interesting and complex and deep holiday. And so I'm excited to go through that all together. So let's start with where the holiday of Hanukkah comes from. Where do we learn about the holiday of Hanukkah? So, does anyone know, where do we read about Hanukkah? Is it in the Torah? Let's start there.
No.
No,
No, it is not in the Torah. Is it in the Hebrew Bible?
no.
Nope, it is not in the Hebrew Bible. So this is the show and tell portion of our class. So this is the what we call the Hebrew Bible, or in Hebrew Tanakh. So you can see mine has little tabs for all the different books. So these are the books that we consider to be part of our kind of most sacred canon, that this is our biblical text. But the thing is, during the time that this was put together, there was a lot of debate, because even though many of these texts are quite old, there were a lot of different books, sacred books, that were kind of floating around. I'll call it floating around in the time of the Second Temple. So we call this the Second Temple period. So in the period of, we'll call it a couple hundred years BCE, before the Common Era, before the time of Jesus, and then the couple hundred years right after zero, the first and second century, there were a lot of different books that were being read and taught and studied and explored as sacred text. Now, of course, this was the time of Jesus and his followers. It was also the time of the early rabbis. And so sometimes when we think about Judaism and Christianity, we think about Judaism as kind of the parent religion, that then Christianity was sort of the child. It came afterwards. But in fact, today, the way we have Judaism today, what we celebrate and observe, is what's called Rabbinic Judaism. And Judaism, as we know it today, developed alongside early Christianity. So in that sense, in a way, they're more sibling traditions, sibling religions, that both were really being developed in the first, second, third, fourth centuries of the Common Era. So in that time, in the first, we'll call it 1 to 200 years after zero, the first and second century CE, there was a lot of question and debate about all of these different books that were being studied and taught. And of course, in the Christian lens, we get all of the books that later on became the New Testament, the Gospels, and a bunch of texts that were specifically sort of Jesus's followers that were writing and teaching. And of course, the rabbis were not considering those to be their sacred texts, were not following those. And so the question was, well, what are our sacred texts? And even though we sometimes talk about how the biblical text, it came from God on high, the truth is, this book, as we know it, developed over time, and that there was a process of canonization. What that means is that there were people who were deciding what's in and what's out. And I like to call this book the A list for Jews. Now, of course, Christians have their own A list, what made the cut in terms of canonization. Although I think sometimes as Jews, we think of the Christian Bible as being monolithic, but even there within Christianity, within different Christian traditions, different denominations, there were differences in what was considered in and what was considered out. But we're going to stick with the Jewish part today. So in the Jewish community and within the rabbinic world, there were questions about what makes the A-list. Which books are we going to agree are part of our sacred canon, are in this Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. And even as late as the time of the Talmud was put together between 200 and 500 of the Common Era. During that time, there were debates about which books were in and which books were out. So, for example, one of the most famous debates was about the Song of Songs. That's a book it's kind of a love poem. It's a little racy, little R-rated. And so there was a lot of debate among the rabbis about whether that would be in or out. Now, you may know it was considered in eventually. It is part of the Tanakh today. So as those debates were happening and decisions were made about what made the cut, what got into the A-list, you can imagine that there were some books that did not make the cut, that got to what I like to call the B list. So the B list we can find today as part of a compilation that's called the Apocrypha. Now I have a version of it here. The one in my office is called the Parallel Apocrypha, just because it has many different versions of it, just different translations of the same text. Most of the books of the Apocrypha were originally written in Greek, but of course were translated into other languages as well. So the Apocrypha are books that in the Jewish world were still considered sacred. These are also sacred texts for us, but they're the B list. They didn't make the A list. They're not in our Bible, but they are books that we might study and learn and consider to be sacred. I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. So as there was an A list and a B list, there were some books that pretty much everybody decided were not going to be part of the sacred canon. So actually, one more thing about the Apocrypha is that these texts, again, they are considered sacred for Jews, but not in the A list. In the Christian world, there was debate about whether they're in the A list or the B list. So there are some Christian denominations for which the Apocrypha is part of their sacred text, the canon, the Bible. And there are others that consider the Apocrypha sort of outside of the biblical text, but still part of the canon. So this is another just example. This is the NRSV Bible. This is a Christian Bible, but you can see it says with the Apocrypha. So again, even within the Christian world, there was some difference. But all of the sort of early Christians and Jews kind of agreed on a number of books that were considered outside of the canon, meaning other books that were kind of floating around, people knew about, people learned, read, talked about, but they decided these are not sacred. These are the books that are not going to make it even into the B list. So I like to call these the D list because they're kind of off the table of sacred literature. Now that is called pseudepigrapha. So pseudo, you can kind of hear that word pseudo, which sometimes we think of as like fake. Now these aren't fake texts, but they just were not considered to be sacred. So the pseudepigrapha is huge. It looks like this in my office. These are two massive books of a compilation. There's volume 1 and volume 2 of the pseudepigrapha. So pseudepigrapha, again, is sort of like the D list. It contains a whole bunch of books that were considered not part of the sacred canon for Jews or Christians. So why am I telling you all of this? Let's get back to our original question. Where does Hanukkah come from? So Hanukkah comes from the book of Maccabees, which you might have heard of the Maccabees. You also might have heard of the book of Maccabees. But like some other biblical books, it's not just one book. So similar to, for example, Samuel, we have 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, or Chronicles, we have 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. We have a number of those examples in our Bible. The book of Maccabees also, there were different books of Maccabees. So there's Maccabees 1, 2, 3, and 4. And Maccabees 1 and 2, or 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees, both made it into, we'll call it the B list, into the Apocrypha. So Maccabees 1 and 2 both are in this book here, and this is our source for Hanukkah. Maccabees 3 and 4 did not make the cut. They can be found in this book, in the pseudepigrapha, and those are not the sources that we use for Hanukkah. So hopefully now you've learned a whole bunch about our sacred literature as well as where Hanukkah comes from. So Hanukkah comes from Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2. And Maccabees 1 and 2 are both describing similar events, but they're coming from a little bit of a different perspective. First Maccabees, author is really describing events from a pretty kind of straightforward way, describing historical events. Maccabees 2 is a more emotional book with a little bit more kind of passion and emotion in it. So they're just written in a little bit different styles and have a little bit of a different emphasis. But I do want to say a word about timeline. So the holiday of Hanukkah is a historical event, meaning the events that we read about in the book of Maccabees are historical. It means they happened. We know they happened. That is different than many other Jewish holidays that celebrate events that we don't know if they happened or not. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. We don't have historical evidence. So for example, the Exodus in Passover, we celebrate that story. It's one of the most important sacred stories for the Jewish people. We don't know if it's a historical event. And in a way, it's besides the point. It's not really about the historicity of the event. Same thing with Purim and the book of Esther. That is a story that we don't know if it's historical, but again, maybe beside the point, it is a holiday that kind of celebrates that story. Hanukkah, on the other hand, is based on historical events, and I think it's helpful to have a sense of the timeline. So the events that are described in the book of Maccabees 1, book of Maccabees 2, those events that actually took place sometime, they took place between the years 167 and 165 BCE, before the Common Era, or BC, before Christ. So again, 167 to 165 BCE is when the events happened. And we're going to read a little bit about what are those events. And First Maccabees and Second Maccabees, those books were written sometime between 134 and 63 BCE. So we don't know exactly when they were written, but we know that they were written in that time period. That's about a 70-year time period. We know that they were written, historians can date books by certain clues about, it must have been written after this or before this. So we know for sure it was written somewhere in that time range. So between 134 and 63 BCE. What that means is that these books were written not right as the events were happening. This is not, the New York Times, Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle. Like, this is not, reporting what happened yesterday. But it is fairly soon after the event. So we'll call it 30 to 100 years afterwards, which means that at the time of their writing, there were probably people who had lived through these events, whether it was their parents, their grandparents. So in a way, it would be, oops, I'm just going to mute. It would be if somebody today were going to write about events from, I don't know, we'll call it the late 20th century, something that happened. I don't know what would be a good example. Maybe somebody today that was writing about the fall of the Berlin Wall, something like that, just in terms of time period. So something that happened a little while ago, but within somewhat recent memory. So that's the time frame of the Maccabees. And that's important to think about because we're going to talk about how the story evolves hundreds of years later when the story kind of changes. So let's go back to Maccabees, and I'd love to look at some text with you. So I'm going to share my screen. Hold on one moment. Okay, so hopefully you can see this now. Can you see? Maybe put up a thumbs up. You can see it? Okay, great. So these are some texts from some of our sources. And at the top, you can see that there is a short little text from the Apocrypha from First Maccabees. Is there somebody that would like to read this little paragraph?
I'll read if you can make it bigger.
Okay, let's see. I probably can. How's that? Good?
No, one more.
Okay, I'll try.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Go for it, Terry.
Moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and everyone should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols, and profaned the Sabbath. For the king had sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and forbid burnt offerings, and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbath and festival days, and pollute the sanctuary and holy people, set up altars and groves and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts, that they should also leave their children uncircumcised, and make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanliness. Whoops. Oh,
Sorry.
Was that you?
I don't know. Can you see it still?
Yeah, it came back. All manner of uncleanliness and profanation, to the end they might forget the law and change all the ordinances. Well, that's nice.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. So I think this is a part of the story that many of you may already be familiar with. The idea that there arose a king, King Antiochus, of the, sometimes we say it was the Greeks, sometimes we say it was the Syrians, it's the Seleucid Empire. It was Greek Syrian that was in charge of that whole region, and that this particular king really started to create laws and practices that were horrible for the Jews, that were forbidding Jewish practice, that were desecrating the temple, were, going into the sanctuary and sacrificing pigs, which were not allowed. All kinds of things that were problematic for the Jewish people. So this is the beginning of the story. I'm going to skip to another text in First Maccabees. I will share my screen one more time, so that hopefully you can see it. And okay. Terry, do you want to keep reading? I think we will. I'm trying to decide where to start.
Yeah.
Let's start with, well, why don't we read this whole thing? Go ahead, from Judas and his brothers.
Judas and his brothers said, "Now that our enemies have been defeated, let's go to Jerusalem to purify the temple and rededicate it." So the whole army was assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they found the temple abandoned, the altar profaned, the gates burned down, the courtyards grown up in a forest of weeds, and the priests' rooms torn down. In their sorrow they tore their clothes, cried loudly, threw ashes on their heads, and fell face down on the ground. When the signal was given on the trumpets, everyone cried out to the Lord.
Okay, we're going to skip the next paragraph, which is about their kind of rebuilding, and they're trying to rebuild the altar. Maybe just go to the last sentence or two. It says they burned incense on the altar.
They burned incense on the altar and lit the lamps on the lampstand, and there was light in the temple. They placed the loaves of bread on the table, hung the curtain, and completed all the work. The 25th day of the...
Keep going.
25th day of the 9th month, the month of Kislev, in the year 148, was the anniversary of the day the Gentiles had desecrated the altar. On that day, a sacrifice was offered on the new altar in accordance with the laws of Moses. The new altar was dedicated, and hymns were sung to the accompaniment of harps, lutes, and cymbals. All the people bowed down with their faces to the ground and worshipped and praised the Lord for giving them victory. For 8 days they celebrated the rededication of the altar. With great joy they brought burnt offerings and offered fellowship offerings and thank offerings. They decorated the front of the temple with gold crowns and shields, rebuilt the gates and the priests' rooms, and put doors on them. Now that the Jews had removed the shame which the Gentiles had brought, they held a great celebration. Then Judas, his brothers, and the entire community of Israel decreed that the rededication of the altar should be celebrated with a festival of joy and gladness at the same time each year, beginning in the 25th of the month of Kislev and lasting for 8 days.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen again. So some of this, I assume, is familiar to many of you, although you might not have read the text itself. So here we're hearing about, this king that made all of these horrible rules. There then is a huge uprising of Judah and the Maccabees, and eventually they they win and they reclaim the temple and they find it destroyed and defiled, not completely destroyed, but I'll call it defiled, and everything's kind of a mess. So they clean it up, they rededicate the altar, and they declare this celebration. So what we're going to do over the next half hour or so is to be looking at how the purpose of Hanukkah and the timing of it changes a little bit over time. So I'm going to show you this document, but we're going to come back to it several different times. So this is hopefully you can see it now. This is a document that we are going to look at about how Hanukkah changes over time. So at the bottom, you can see that the Hanukkah events, what we're reading about, these events with Antiochus and the Maccabees, was again those dates 167 to 165 BCE. And now in First Maccabees, we have this description. So from this description, let's think about why are we celebrating Hanukkah and why is it 8 days? So what do you think? From what we read, would anyone like to share? Why are we celebrating Hanukkah? You can either jump in or you can raise your hand.
Well, we reclaim the temple.
So reclaim the temple. Phil, it looked like you were talking, but you have to unmute. Okay, I think we're having trouble unmuting over there. That's okay. Michael?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it sounds like from this reading, it's really just the rededication of the temple, right? The cleaning up and getting it back into working order.
Exactly. So we're reclaiming the temple. We are rededicating the temple. We're celebrating the victory. Go ahead, Phil.
Basically the same thing, rededication. Yes.
Okay.
Very
good.
There's the old Jewish proverb, they attacked us, we prevailed, let's eat.
Yes, exactly. So they attacked us, we won, let's eat. So there's really two things that I hear you mentioning. One is the rededication of the temple itself, the kind of making the altar holy again, and we're going to celebrate that. And what I would call here is the military victory, right? The bravery, we won, hooray, let's celebrate, right? We're going to have a huge festival to celebrate our victory in this military uprising and victory. And from this text from First Maccabees, and I know I just gave you a tiny snippet of a whole book, but why do you think it was 8 days? It did say 8 days. Hopefully you saw that. Why 8 days? Do you know, or could you tell?
No.
So the reason is not given here, but you'd have to know a little bit more kind of about the temple in order to know, which is that it takes 8 days to dedicate a temple. That is a regular standard thing. So even if we look back in the Torah and the creation of the Mishkan, and then later on the building of the first temple and the building of the second temple, that there is this idea that when we are dedicating a temple, a new holy space, that there was kind of an 8-day process to do that. So here, the 8 days in some ways isn't just a random number, but it's because that's how long it takes to dedicate a temple. So I'm going to write that on this little document that we're going to create together. Terry, question.
Well, if the Hanukkah means rededication,
Mm-hmm.
and the earlier times before the temple, but they still had to dedicate the Mishkans, different places. Is that word used in any other places?
I don't know. I'd have to look it up. I'm not sure. It's a good question. The root, for sure, yes. The root of the word Hanukkah is used all over the place, but as its own kind of day, I'm not sure. But Chanukah Tabayit, which means to dedicate a temple, is definitely, that phrase is used often.
Okay.
Yes, Chanukah Tabayit is to dedicate the temple. Phil.
So in current times, if a temple is damaged, is it 8 days to rededicate?
Well, the short answer is no, because these were the temples where they offered sacrifices, like animal sacrifices, like it was a different kind of worship. So today with synagogues, we might do dedications and special services and ceremonies, but it's just completely different. Once the second temple was destroyed, we no longer had a temple of that sort anymore, the kind that people would bring sacrifices in that way. So let's continue on with the next. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Michael.
So I'm wondering, is there more in the text sort of related to the military victory? Does it go into more detail about how that happened and kind of what went down? Maybe we didn't read it, but, or is it just alluded to sort of in terms of, you know, the miracle, rededication, and the holiday?
The short answer is yes. I mean, it's a whole book, so there's way more than
Okay.
what I just put here.
Yeah.
The longer answer is, at least for today, we're not going to go into some of the depths of that, but it is a really important and interesting question. And we're going to get to the end today, which is, where is Hanukkah today and what are we celebrating? And in some ways, the origins of this story are even more resonant today than they maybe have ever been. So, you know, going back to those sources and looking at them and wrestling with them is absolutely what we should be doing right now. And I want to offer that if anyone wants to come and borrow Book of Maccabees 1 or 2, please feel free. I'm sure you could probably find it online too, and Safari or other places. But if you want to come borrow the hard copy book, I'm happy to share. Let's move to Maccabees 2, because we'll see something new here. So in Maccabees 2, again, we hear about the military victory and the dedication of the temple. Like, the story is the same, but we do get a few different details, and we also get a different kind of vibe, I'll say. So there's a little paragraph here that I will share and would love somebody to read. Is there anyone who would like to read? Terry did great. Is there anyone else who wants to jump in, do some reading? You don't have to. Okay, Phil. Great. So just make sure to unmute yourself, and I am going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see it. Go ahead and read where it says, now Maccabeus and his company. And every time it says Lord, you can say Lord or God. Go ahead.
Phil, unmute.
You got to unmute. The challenges of Zoom. Okay, you know what, Phil, I think that maybe I'll just read just for the sake of time. All right, so now Maccabeus and his company, with God guiding them, recovered the temple and the city, but the altars which the heathen had built in the open street, and also the chapels, they pulled down. And having cleansed the temple, they made another altar, and striking stones, they took fire out of them, and offered a sacrifice after 2 years, and set forth incense and lights and shewbread. When that was done, they fell flat down and besought God that they might come no more into such troubles. But if they sinned any more against him, that he himself would chasten them with mercy, they might not be delivered unto the blasphemous and barbarous nations. Barbarous nations. Now, upon the same day that the strangers profaned the temple, on the very same day it was cleansed again, even the 25th day of the same month, which is Kislev. And they kept the 8 days with gladness, as in the feast of Sukkot. So I want you to hold that thought. We're going to go to another section from Maccabees 2. You'll see here, in the year 169, and the way they count the years is a little different than how we now count years, so you can kind of ignore that a bit. In the year 169, when Demetrius II was king of Syria, we wrote to tell you about the persecution and the hard times that came upon us in the years after Jason revolted against authority in the Holy Land. Jason is from the side of the Greeks. Jason and his men set fire to the temple gates and slaughtered innocent people. Then we prayed to God, and God answered our prayers. So we sacrificed animals, gave offerings of grain, lit the lamps in the temple, and set out the sacred loaves. This is why we urge you to celebrate in the month of Kislev a festival similar to the festival of shelters or booths, which is Sukkot. Okay, so let's now take a look at 2nd Maccabees. What is it that in 2nd Maccabees we are celebrating when we are celebrating Hanukkah? And why is it 8 days? What did you take from this little piece of text? Go ahead, Phil, if you want. I think you're unmuted now.
It seems so similar, though. I mean,
Yeah, it is similar. It is similar. Okay, so they're rededicating the temple, right? They lit the lamps. They're rededicating the temple. They're coming back to it. And of course, they're celebrating this military victory. Right? There was 1 or 2 other little pieces. I'm not sure if any of you caught. Why is it 8 days?
Well, it seems like they're taking a page from Sukkot. You know, they're mirroring Sukkot. Like, this is a happy occasion, military victory. You know, and you know, Sukkot is, I guess, kind of sort of a harvest festival, but it's a festival nonetheless.
Exactly.
And you know, they seem to have said, well, you know, if 8 days was good enough for Sukkot, then it's good enough for this.
Yeah, kind of like that. So definitely Sukkot is given as a reason multiple times and with, I think, different reasons. So one of the reasons that Sukkot is mentioned here is because during the time of the siege, during the time of the war, which was years, it was a couple of years long. This wasn't a quick couple month battle. They couldn't observe the holidays in the regular way that they used to, because remember, in these ancient times, the way that they worshiped God was by going to the temple and offering sacrifices. And if they're having these big battles, it's this whole military campaign that's happening and a siege and the temple's been destroyed, they actually could not celebrate Sukkot in the way that they normally did. Of course, they could still build a sukkah, but Sukkot is a pilgrimage festival. It was a festival where people would come to Jerusalem, to the temple with their offerings, their first fruits, the grains. It's a harvest festival. And they couldn't celebrate it. So we seem to be getting from this text that part of what Hanukkah was at the time was a delayed Sukkot. Like we couldn't do it. And now we finally can, a couple years later, or also really 2 months later, which is that during the time of Sukkot, even this year, whatever this year was, then we couldn't do it. And now here we are in Kislev, a couple months, Hebrew months later, let's come and kind of have a delayed Sukkot. So it seems to be piece of it is that. The other piece that, again, you just may not know historically is that Sukkot was a very popular holiday. Sukkot then was like our Hanukkah today. Like it's the holiday all the Jews knew and Jews celebrated, and it was super popular and everybody loved Sukkot. And so not only is it this delayed Sukkot, like we didn't get to have our regular Sukkot, so let's now do it a couple months later. But in this, the second little piece of text I showed you is actually a letter from Jews in Jerusalem who were writing to Jews outside the land of Israel, Jews in Egypt, basically saying, you should do this holiday. It's just like Sukkot. Meaning, you know, that other holiday you really like? This one's going to be just like that. It's going to be 8 days. It's going to be a festive celebration. And so it seems to be both a delayed Sukkot and trying to get people to adapt the holiday with the same festivity and energy that they had around Sukkot. So when they're talking about it being 8 days, there seems to be a direct parallel here to Sukkot. Okay, so that's another layer. Let's move forward in history. So eventually, so at the time, the Maccabees recapture the temple. That begins what's called the Hasmonean dynasty. So there's a time of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. Over time, that starts to become complicated. The Hasmonean dynasty starts to kind of lose its power. Eventually, what's called the Herodian dynasty, King Herod, some of you might be familiar with, ends up coming into power. And basically from the time of 63 BC, when the Romans start to take over, the Jewish community in Israel is still allowed to be Jewish and practice, but it becomes really controlled by the Romans. And of course, as many of you know, eventually the Romans destroy the temple and exile the Jews, which is in the year 70 CE. So we're now talking a couple hundred years later. Maybe not a couple hundred, but 150 years later. So the year 70 CE, Jews are exiled from the land. The temple at this point is destroyed. It's not just defiled or things are broken, but it's really destroyed. We have no more temple. Even, of course, to this day, if you visit the Temple Mount, what we visit at the Western Wall is really a retaining wall. So the temple itself is gone since the year 70. Then eventually we get the establishment of rabbinic Judaism, and the rabbis are really wrestling with how do we be Jewish in the diaspora outside the land of Israel? How do we be Jewish when we don't have a temple anymore to do all those rituals that used to be very based in the pilgrimage to the temple and with the sacrifices and the offerings? So they're developing a whole new way of being Jewish. And hundreds of years later, the time of the Talmud, we get another piece about Hanukkah. Of course, this is one of the most famous parts of Hanukkah. So, but I don't know if you've read the text, so we're going to read the text. This comes from the Babylonian Talmud, which the Talmud was compiled or written. The teachings of the Talmud come from the year 200 to the year about 500 CE of the Common Era. So there's a few hundred years that these texts all kind of come together, and it gets compiled into the Talmud in the 6th century. So this is in what's called Tractate Shabbat. I'm going to share my screen. again so we can see the text. All right. Is there anyone who would like to read this one? What is the reason for Hanukkah by the rabbis? Just jump in.
I'll go ahead and read it. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes, we can.
What is the reason for Hanukkah? For our rabbis taught on the 25th day of Kislev, the 8 days of Hanukkah began, during which lamentation for the dead and fasting are forbidden. For when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oils therein, and when the Hasmonean dynasty prevailed and defeated them, they made search and found only one cruse of oil, which lay with the seal of the high priest, but which contained sufficient oil for 1 day's lighting only. Yet a miracle was wrought therein, and they lit the lamp therewith for 8 days. The following year, these days were declared a festival with the recitation of Hallel, hymns of praise, and thanksgiving.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so here we have the famous story of the oil, that there was only a small amount of oil, one little cruse of oil. And not just that there was, that's how much oil there was, but at the time that the temple stood, it wasn't just any oil. It was oil made in a special way and purified in a special way. And so it's mentioned here that it has that stamp of approval, basically, from the high priest. So it's the type of oil that we need. And there was only enough to last probably 1 day, but then it ended up lasting 8 days. And partly what that meant is that that was enough days for them to prepare more of this kind of special oil that they would then use to light the Ner Tamid, the light that never goes out. So this is the story of the oil that is very famous. I'm assuming all of you have heard this story before. We talk about it all the time with kids and in the public sphere. And even when we're lighting our Chanukiot, we're, kind of talking about that oil that lasted 8 days. So this is very, very famous story. What some of you may know and some of you may not know is that this is the first appearance of the story in our texts, is here in the Talmud. So we're now talking about 500 years, let's say, after the events of Hanukkah took place, maybe more, 500, 600, 700 years later. So does that mean it didn't happen? I don't know. Maybe it did happen. We don't know. Maybe it was a story that was told and was passed on until eventually it got written down. We don't know if it's historical or not, but it's a story that the rabbis told. So why do you think that this story was taught and passed along by the rabbis? Any thoughts? Because it is a little bit of a different story than what we read before. Terry.
Yeah, I read in another talk that the rabbis wanted to celebrate the people's victory, God's victory, and the miracle of the oil, rather than the military. To focus more on the miracle of the oil and rededication versus the military part.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Does anyone else want to add to that before I do?
Well, I was just going to say something similar, but sort of, were they trying to, I don't know, I guess jazz up the story a little bit and make it to appeal to the masses that there's a, sort of a divine intervention here to sort of inspire, or coax people to celebrate this and add some, maybe a flair to the story, regardless of whether that part was true, right? And steer away from just, the military defeat being the first miracle and how great it was, but adding some flair to it. But yeah.
Okay. So we could be adding a little bit of flair, jazzing up the story, bringing in kind of the divine piece. Absolutely. So another kind of just piece of historical information that is probably helpful to know here is that the rabbis did not like the Maccabees. The rabbis did not like the Hasmoneans. Any idea why they didn't like the Hasmoneans? Well, I am glad to tell you, because basically the Hasmoneans lost us the temple and Jerusalem eventually. So, it was a little while later. It wasn't right at that time, but the rabbis look back and feel like, you won the battle, but lost the war. Meaning, yes, the Maccabees rose up. they rededicated the temple, but then the Hasmonean dynasty took over, and over time it became very corrupt, it became very ineffective. They eventually were ruled by the Romans, and then of course the Romans destroyed the whole thing. So the rabbis do not look fondly at the Maccabees and at the descendants of the Maccabees. And so that's one piece, is that the rabbis probably were trying to downplay the emphasis on the Maccabees and their victory. Another piece is that the rabbis, at least in the Babylonian Talmud, were living outside the land of Israel. And they, first of all, didn't have any military capability. They weren't part of the political question of power. They were not in any kind of political power. And so they're trying to reformulate a Judaism that can exist in the world without political power. And so having a holiday that really focuses on this military victory and being in charge and having sovereignty over the land was not very appealing, I would say, to them. And the other piece is that the rabbis were stuck with Hanukkah, because it's a little bit opposite actually of what you were saying, Michael. You're like, maybe they're trying to jazz it up for the masses. If anything, I think they might have been perfectly happy to let Hanukkah fade away as a holiday that people didn't really care about, because they didn't really want us to focus on the Maccabees and their victory. But by the time of the Talmud, Hanukkah was super popular. People are celebrating Hanukkah, and people are, lighting lights and having this 8-day festival in the month of Kislev. And so the rabbis were trying to figure out, how do we sort of honor that this is a holiday that has become pretty normative in the Jewish community and people are celebrating it, and yet what are different ways to not only be focusing on the Maccabees and this military victory and dedicating the temple, which, by the way, we have no temple now. So for us, living, a couple thousand years later, the pain of not having the temple is not, we don't really feel that in any visceral way. But in those, few generations, even couple of centuries right after the destruction of the temple, the rabbis are really grappling with, what does it mean to be Jewish without a temple? So to focus on a holiday that's about rededicating the temple is really a little problematic for them. So now, of course, this is my understanding from what I've learned from my teachers. I'm sure there are lots of different explanations given. But as we think about this story of the oil, it does give a different frame for Hanukkah, that Hanukkah is not only about this military victory and the land and the temple, but it's about the light. It's about the light that didn't go out. It's about God's presence and God, being with us, and that God can work miracles. And so connecting it to light and to God is just sort of shifting the emphasis a little bit on what this holiday is all about. So let's briefly jump into the Middle Ages. So we're going to skip another 500 years or so, and we get to the putting together of our prayer book. Now, the prayer book that we have today is a compilation of prayers from lots of different periods of Jewish history. And some of the prayers themselves are quite old. We read about them in the Talmud. But the first time we actually have a prayer book, sort of all together with liturgy as we know it, is around the 10th, 11th century. And so from that point on, then we have historical evidence of prayers that are being done kind of in a certain way and in a certain order. And you may know that on Hanukkah, there is a prayer that we add into the Amidah, to one of our main prayers, and that is called Al Hanisim, which means for the miracles. And this is a prayer that, again, kind of tells the story in a very particular way. So this is through a rabbinic lens, but it's in the Middle Ages when we really start to see this as a regular practice in prayers. So I'm going to share my screen. I think for the sake of time, I'll read it. So this is in Al Hanisim. It's in the Amidah. It's also in Birkat Hamazon, which is the blessing after we eat. We thank you for the miracles and for the salvation and for the mighty deeds and for the victories and for the battles which you performed for our forefathers in those days at this time. In the days of Matityahu, the son of Yochanan the high priest, the Hasmonean, and his sons, when the wicked Greek kingdom rose up against your people Israel to make them forget your Torah and compel them to stray from the statutes of your will, you, in your great mercy, stood up for them in their time of their distress. You took up their grievance, judged their claim, avenged their wrong. You delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and the wanton into the hands of the diligent students of your Torah. For yourself, you made a great and holy name in your world, and for your people Israel, you worked a great victory and salvation as this very day. Thereafter, your children came to the Holy of Holies of your house, cleansed your temple, purified the site of your holiness, and kindled lights in the courtyards of your sanctuary. And they established these 8 days of Hanukkah to express thanks and praise to your great name. Okay, so back to our little chart, which I'm going to share. Why are we celebrating Hanukkah? What is Hanukkah all about? Anyone have a thought based on this prayer? All right, I'll sum it up. God. It's all about God. So I'm going to go back to this document to be able to see the development now. So hopefully you can see. So I'm going to write, God saved us. So at this point, the story has really shifted to being all about God. God saved us. God, delivered us from this evil, this evil kingdom. And we're so grateful to God. And so we're going to celebrate God for these 8 days. So this is a very different story, or a different way of thinking about the story. So hopefully you can see here now in this chart that it started out really focused on this military victory, the rededication of the temple. It started out as 8 days because that's how long it takes to dedicate a temple. It's kind of a temple rededication celebration. Then we get the story about Sukkot. It's either Sukkot delayed or just to kind of mimic Sukkot, which was a popular holiday. Then we get the story of the oil. And by this point, in the medieval period, we still now have the story of the oil as well as the Maccabees. The focus really at this point is about God and God's role in events. I want to mention that in the book, in Maccabees 1, God is barely mentioned at all. God is mentioned, but not much. In Maccabees 2, there's a little bit more about God, like God was with us kind of thing. But Maccabees 1 is really not about God at all. It's about the Maccabees and their strength and their victory. And again, moving into the rabbinic time period and into the medieval period where Jews had no power, Jews were powerless. The feeling of we kind of want and need God to be with us and to save us and to help us through dark times. And that Hanukkah is a reminder of God's presence and God's ability to protect us and help us in our times of trouble. So that's a different layer that we get in the medieval period. Then we are going to jump all the way to the modern period, to the 20th century. So why do we celebrate Hanukkah today? And I don't want you to be, scholars here. I want you to pretend like you're a Jew on the street or a person on the street that I said, why do Jews, what is Judaism all about with Hanukkah at this time of year? Why do Jews celebrate Hanukkah?
Well, for me, to be purposeful, to be mindful of the past, and to make it relevant for today. So there's either real stories or invented stories, but like a lot of things, just it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It's what's the point, and so there's a few points in the Hanukkah story.
So I totally agree with you, and I'm going to be much more crass because it's the Jewish Christmas. Christmas, people, Christmas.
I was going to say, Rabbi, it's engaging for the kids. I mean, it gets kids involved and they love it, right?
Yeah, so kids love Hanukkah. But again, we're being very kind here. Today, Hanukkah in the 20th century, prior to the 20th century, Hanukkah was a very minor holiday. It was celebrated and people lit candles and had a holiday, but it was not a big deal. Hanukkah became a big deal in the 20th century, largely because of Christmas. And modern ways that Christmas has also become kind of this big secular thing with all the presents and Santa and the way we know Christmas today. So in our modern period, especially in America, although it's true in some other parts of the world, but especially in America, Hanukkah became huge. Hanukkah is, for some Jews, the only holiday that they celebrate. And in part, it's because of the influence of Christmas, that Christmas is so popular. It's a federal holiday. It's something that most Americans have some connection to or celebration of. And so in a way, Hanukkah became the Jewish Christmas. So this is our holiday of lights at this time of year. And of course, none of these other stories went away. So I'm not discounting them at all, but it became very, very popular in large part because of Christmas. And when we think about 8 days, now, of course, it's not why we have 8 days, but it's like 8 days of presents, and it's like even better than Christmas. You get 8 days of presents. So there was really this kind of tension and push and pull with Hanukkah in its proximity to Christmas that has really shifted the experience of Hanukkah in this time. Terry, I see your hand.
Well, is it celebrated to this obscene extent in Israel?
Not in the way that it is here. No, not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very different kind of thing. So I want to share that. I'm going to one more time just share the screen of this chart, just so you can kind of see it visually laid out about this shift. And then I want to say a few more words in our last 5 minutes together. So if you see the evolution of the holiday, starting out from this military victory and the dedication of the temple, moving on, questions about Sukkot and, what holiday are we celebrating? Then we add the story of the oil. We add this layer of kind of the divine presence and God's involvement in whichever story, whether it's about the military victory or the oil. And then, of course, in this modern period, kind of wrestling with being Jewish in a Christian world and the influence of Christmas and how that is celebrated on the Jewish community. And today, when you think about how people celebrate Hanukkah, maybe we don't like to think about this, but a lot of celebrations are parallel to Christmas. People decorate their homes, they put up lights, they, wear crazy shirts, all the things that, and again, from a religious standpoint in the Christian world, that's not like religious Christmas either, but kind of the secular version of Christmas has certainly made its way into Jewish practice in terms of how people observe the holiday. So I want to say a few words kind of in sum, and then I'm happy to take a few questions and kind of we'll wrap up. But one of the reasons I really love to explore this holiday through the timeline is to show that this holiday is continually evolving. And of course, this year with the events of October 7th and what's happening in Israel and Gaza right now, that leads us to all sorts of other questions about what Hanukkah represents at this time, wrestling with questions of power, of military victory. What does that mean? What does that look like? Feelings of vulnerability, feelings of power. All of those questions are coming to the fore this year in a way that maybe they haven't for us as Jews in recent years. But also in a weird sort of way, what Hanukkah was originally about, even in those years 167 to 165 BCE, has returned in the modern period when we think about it through that lens of Jewish Christmas, which is that the earliest events, and I didn't spend any time talking about this at the beginning, the early events when the Maccabees rose up in revolt, they were really revolting against two things. They were revolting against the Greeks and this, empire that was saying you can't do these Jewish practices. But they were equally rebelling against Jews who were adapting those Greek practices and Jews who were assimilating and Jews who were participating in Greek culture. And the Maccabees actually were extremists of their time. It's another reason the rabbis didn't like the Maccabees. They were real extremists, but they were rising up against Jews who were assimilating. And so at the core of the story is about the question of how to be Jewish in a non-Jewish world. How do we wrestle with our Jewish identity when we live in a world in which Jews either do or do not have power, in which the ruling powers do or do not support us as Jews? And how do we navigate both in terms of culture and in terms of politics, what it means to be Jewish? And today, when we look at where we are at in this current moment, we are wrestling with both of those things. What does it mean to be Jewish in a world in which Christmas is everywhere? Every store you walk into is playing Christmas music. There's Christmas trees everywhere. How do we be Jewish? How do we be a minority in a culture that is dominated by something else that's not Jewish? That is definitely a pressing question of our time, not just this year, but of course in the last generation or two. And questions about, on the political side, how do we be Jewish in an environment where sometimes it's hard to be Jewish? It's scary to be Jewish. Being Jewish is not accepted in some cases, where there's anti-Semitism, where Jews aren't allowed to practice their Judaism, right? Like those are questions that, not to the extent of the time of the Greek Empire, we aren't seeing that, in America today, but those questions of how do we be Jewish in an environment where it is either hard or uncomfortable or impossible to be Jewish, those are challenges that we face today. And then, of course, coming back to those questions of kind of the role of a military, it's a little bit different today, of course, because we have the state of Israel. But even thinking about the Hasmonean dynasty and what does it mean for Jews to have power, and how do we wrestle with Jewish sovereignty, those are questions that Hanukkah raises as well. So all of those, so many of the things that were kernels of Hanukkah, even from the very beginning, even through all of these changes throughout the generations, really are still true today, and things that I think we're wrestling with really every day. So a very, very relevant holiday for our time. All right, last few minutes, any thoughts or questions, reactions? Phil?
What would have happened if this holiday didn't come at this particular time and not even close to Christmas? Wonder what the holiday what form it would take.
It's a really good thought experiment. I mean, it may not look like it does today. The story of the oil and the kind of celebrating the military victory and all of that may still exist, but the way in which we observe it might be very, very different, because it really has been influenced by Christmas, at least in the modern period, not so much in the pre-modern period. Michael?
Yeah, I'm just curious if there was, sort of, there's always debate in the Talmud. So if some of the Talmudic discussions, in terms of how they felt about the Maccabees, was there also rabbis who felt like, hey, these guys, yes, we're kind of extreme, but also trying to keep the rituals and the rules, and trying to, keep what's ours, instead of the very, extreme assimilation that was going on at the time? Was there sort of back and forth about that, or were they all like, these guys are just crazy extremists? Yes, they did a good thing, but
So my sharing of rabbinic viewpoints of the Maccabees in a way doesn't come from the Talmud. The part in the Talmud that talks about the miracle of the oil is really, it's in Tractate Shabbat. It's talking about candle lighting and what are we doing when we light candles on Hanukkah. So there's not, I'm doing Daf Yomi, so I'm studying a page of Talmud every day for 7.5 years. I'm a little more than halfway done. I'm almost 2/3 the way done at the moment. So I haven't read every page of the Talmud yet, but I'm getting there. The pieces that I've read, I haven't read anything where the rabbis are debating anything about the Maccabees. What I have learned from my teachers and scholars is more about kind of maybe other things that the rabbis have said or written, or even just maybe it's posited about why they might have had discomfort with the Maccabees. But it's not in the Talmud itself, as far as I know.
And is that discomfort really the sort of, you guys were extremists? Is that where their discomfort comes from?
I think the discomfort is more from the fact that the temple was destroyed in 70 and the Hasmonean dynasty didn't last. I think that's probably more the impulse to minimize the Maccabees. One thing I forgot to say, because I was really focused on the modern period in America and the way that Christmas has influenced Hanukkah, what I forgot to say is that Zionism really revived the Maccabees, meaning in the late 19th and early 20th century, as there was this, effort to say we need to return to the land and build Jewish sovereignty, the Maccabees were held up as a symbol, and the Maccabees are hugely, I don't know if popular is the right word, but it is a big part of Israeli identity, is connected to the idea of the Maccabees, of Jewish power, Jewish sovereignty, not letting others determine our destiny. And so I don't want to say the Maccabees are all bad or we should demonize them. We should know they were extremists for their time. But at the same time, the idea that there were people who stood up to say, we Jews have to stand up for ourselves and and fight back against this effort to minimize Jewish expression and Jewish identity, that the mantle, I guess I would say, of the Maccabees was really taken up by the early Zionists, like the first waves of Aliyah, viewed themselves as modern day Maccabees to kind of come and, in a way, sort of reclaim Jewish land and Jewish sovereignty. So that is worth knowing. Okay, Steve, and then Jack, and then I think we'll have to wrap up. Steve.
Yeah, so one thing I learned today, or had forgotten and relearned, was that the Maccabees were in their day seen as, an extremist movement, within Judea. What strikes me is how this has been, rather common through Jewish history. The Maccabees, later the Sicarii, and their role in the destruction of Jerusalem, and all the way to present day. It seems like there's always, and I guess, and perhaps the Jewish people are not unique in this regard, but it just seems that there's always been this either political or religiously extremist movement attached to the Jewish experience.
So what I would say that where I really agree with you is that throughout Jewish history, there has been a range of expressions of Judaism and a range of views on what we should do and kind of how far to take things. So there have always been, Judaism is Jewish practice and observance is kind of on a spectrum with different ways of viewing things. And so, yes, there have always been Jewish extremists throughout history, in different extremes, in different directions. So that is absolutely true. I want to share one thing about the sort of extremist side of Judaism. There was an excellent article that was written in the New York Times by David Brooks it was December 11th, 2009. I have a copy of it because I had printed it out at that time and shared it. That is called The Hanukkah Story, and it's all about Hanukkah. And it talks about how that when the Maccabees rose up, the first person they killed was a fellow Jew. And it was in the town of Modi'in. And it was a Jew who was attempting to perform a sacrifice on a new Greek altar. And Matisyahu slaughtered that person, killed them, and then that led to the revolt of the Maccabees against the Greek regime. And so the idea that they were extremists, I would say, is not really debated. They definitely were pretty extreme in their views, and yet they also were responsible for Jews reclaiming the temple and having Jewish sovereignty. And so those are the questions of sort of, what do we do even with internal Jewish conflict, and how far do we take things, and what do we do with the extremists in our midst? These are hard questions. Jack.
On a lighter note, you mentioned
Yes.
about the Jewish Christmas.
Yes.
There's this wonderful PBS show that I watched the other day called The Jewish Christmas. And it's
Mhm.
about all the Christmas songs written by Jewish composers, especially Irving Berlin, who wrote White White Christmas.
Exactly. Many of the most famous Christmas songs were written by Jews. That is true. We could do a whole other class on Judaism and Christmas and Jews and Christmas. And in the early 20th century, lots of Jews who came to America had Christmas trees. And anyway, there's a whole story there too. But for today, we'll focus on Hanukkah. I hope this has been helpful and interesting. There are so many interesting things written about Hanukkah, so I encourage you to kind of keep reading, and I'm happy to share more sources if you want to contact me as well. But I hope that you have a happy Hanukkah, and that, again, as we light the lights and we focus on light in this very dark time, that we also use this as an opportunity for some of that internal reflection about what do we want to do as Jews in the world? How do we want to be Jewish in a world that's not Jewish? How do we want to wrestle with these questions of identity and culture and power? They're all very hard questions for our time. So hopefully we'll reflect on those, and we'll celebrate, and we'll light the lights, and take in a little light when we need it most. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi.
so much,
Thanks,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.